Yes.
The Senate Foreign Relations business meeting will come to order. We're going to do just a little bit of business on the front end and hopefully take care of some business quickly. I know people have other meetings, and then we're going to move to the hearing itself. We do thank our witnesses for allowing us to do this, and we're glad you're here. We have a number of items on the agenda today. We will move a number of nominations and Foreign Service Officer list. We will also take up S. 1928, the Multilateral Aid Review Act of 2017. I want to thank Senator Coons for his leadership and hard work on this bill. I want to also recognize Senators Isaacson, Rubio, Young, Kane, and Merkley for their contributions to this important bipartisan legislation before our committee. This bill would establish a process for conducting objective reviews on how well multilateral institutions carry out their missions with our funding. The authorities sunset after 4 review periods and 11 years. Through this process, we will be able to evaluate their performance in an objective way. The review will look at performance, management, accountability, and transparency, alignment with U.S. foreign policy goals, and efficiency. The U.S. spent around $11 billion to support the work of these entities, and we owe the U.S. taxpayers good value for their money. These reviews will help us make better informed decisions about how to prioritize scarce resources. It will also provide solid grounds for advocating for changes and reforms. Others, such as the United Kingdom and Australia, have done similar reviews of their multilateral and contributions with good results, by the way, multilateral aid contributions with good results. I urge you to support this effort to promote greater accountability for our spending on multilateral entities. Senator Cardin, do you have any comments you wish to make?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. But before I comment on the bill and nominations that are on our agenda, I want to comment regarding information statistics regarding the Foreign Service that has been made public over the last week. Ambassador Barbara Stevenson of the American Foreign Service Association stated last week that, and I quote, "There is no denying that our leadership ranks are being depleted at a dizzying speed, due in part to decision to slash promotion numbers by more than half. The Foreign Service Officer Corps at State has lost 60% of its career ambassadors since January. Ranks of the career ministers, our 3-star equivalents, are down from 33 to 19. The ranks of our 2-star ministers, counselors, have fallen from 431 after Labor Day to 369 today and are still falling. Ambassador Stevenson, who is the president of the governing board of the AFSA, is imploring us to ask why. Well, I feel like I have been asking why of the administration and the State Department on a lot of issues lately, including the myriad personnel, budget, and reorganization matters. I'm not getting a lot of answers. Just as one small example, although the Trump administration lifted the federal hiring freeze in April of 2017, the State Department and the USAID has elected to keep its own hiring freeze in place. Why? My impression is that the morale is at an all-time low at the State Department and USAID, causing a massive exodus of diplomatic and development expertise. Why is this happening, and what is the department's leadership doing about it? Our president said recently that we do not need to worry about the fact that many of the senior-level positions at the State Department remain unfilled, because when it comes to foreign policy, his opinion is the only one that matters. Why on earth would he say that? For the thousands of FSOs around the world working to advance the ideals of the United States, this was a horrible message. If this is the sort of high-level decapitation of leadership we're going on at the Defense Department, with 3- and 4-star officers resigning and younger officers and enlisted personnel suffering low morale and leaving as well, or not even signing up, I can guarantee you that Congress would be up in arms. Yet here, there is silence. Why? The State Department and USAID, I would offer, are every bit as vital and critical an element to our national security as the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, our law enforcement, and a myriad of others in the federal government who work tirelessly every day to protect our security, extend our prosperity, and promote our values. Folks, this situation is alarming. We put our country in danger when we do not have adequate voice and resources to all of our country's national security tools. Secretary Madeleine Albright once said, "In turbulent and perilous world, the men and women of foreign service are the front lines every day on every continent for us." This committee needs to continue to press this issue. It's our responsibility to make sure that we have the diplomatic assets in place in order to represent our national security. Moving to the legislative item, I want to thank Senator Corker and Coons for their efforts on this bill. The multilateral institutions are a critical part of our foreign assistance efforts. They help us coordinate activities, leverage funds, and advance our national interests and values. If successful, the Multilateral Aid Review Act will provide us with clear metrics, reliable data, and solid analysis of our multilateral investments. Mr. Chairman, I hope every member of the committee will read the bill, because I think it does spell out what our expectations are in regards to carrying out mission, the right use of resources, and that we review this on a periodic basis so that we make sure that our multilateral efforts are in our national security interests. I think this is an important bill, and I applaud you for your work. One last point, if I might. I know we have a quorum, but one last point. We're getting near the end of this work period. We only have one more work period remaining before we adjourn for the year. There is an extremely important bill that Senator Rubio and Baldwin have been working on, the JUST Act, which will require additional State Department reporting on European government efforts to return or provide restitution for property wrongly seized during the Holocaust. I've said this before, but time's running out on this issue as people are getting much older, fewer are surviving, and it's becoming much more difficult to deal with restitution. I really applaud the work that was done on this bill. I know that there are many members of this committee that are co-sponsors, including Senator Johnson, Young, Booker, Coons, Menendez, and Markey. And I would just urge the Democrat and Republican staff to try to get together with the sponsors to see whether we cannot move this bill through our committee this year, and I appreciate the chairman's attention.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if it's possible, because I know we have conflicts taking place at 10:15, if we could go ahead and move through the business. If people want to make comments afterwards, I'm glad to hear it, and obviously we're going to have a long hearing. Let me just say, we had a very unsatisfactory meeting last week with the State Department. Our two staffs did. I think the concerns about the State Department are bipartisan in nature. I don't think they're anywhere close to having a plan to present relative to the reforms they want to make there. And I do think that we need to be much more focused on holding them accountable, because I think many of the things that you said, if not all, but many of them anyway, are very true. With that, I understand that Mr. Ulen, for the Undersecretary of State Management, has been held over, and he'll be considered in the next business meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve the remaining nominations en bloc by voice vote, including Ms. Lisa Johnson, Mr. Sean Lawler, Mr. Steve Goldstein, Ms. Rebecca Gonzalez, and 2 Foreign Service officer lists. Unless there's a so moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Are there any recorded noes that any individuals would like on any of these nominations? Seeing none, the ayes have it, and the nominations and promotions are agreed to. Next, we'll move to S 1928. First, I would entertain a motion to approve the substitute amendment and the Portman amendment en bloc by voice vote.
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second? So moved and seconded. The questions on the motion to approve the substitute amendment and the Portman amendment en bloc. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? With that, the ayes have it. The amendments are agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the work of the Committee on the Multilateral Aid Review Act of 2017. I have 2 amendments here. I'd like to thank Senator Rubio for joining me as a co-sponsor of both of these amendments. One addresses the issue of Taiwan. It talks about using the United States voice and our vote in international organizations to make sure that we're advocating for the addition of Taiwan as an observer to such organizations and entities. We did it last year with Interpol, and I believe we should stand up for Taiwan as a great partner and especially an important voice in these international organizations. The other amendment is addressing North Korea, and in a meeting that Senator Markey and I hosted with a former resident of North Korea, defector, a high-level defector, the deputy ambassador to United Kingdom, has said that the one thing that could make a difference in North Korea is cutting off diplomatic relations with North Korea, other nations around the globe that haven't done that yet, and isolating diplomatically North Korea as much as possible. And so this amendment would use our voice and vote in international organizations and entities to do just that, to make sure that we are stressing the importance of diplomatic isolation of the North Korean regime. And I think these 2 amendments present a very significant contrast, because you have Taiwan, somebody that we want to partner with, somebody that is an incredible partner, somebody who abides by and respects the rule of law, that cannot participate in these international organizations. And then you have one, North Korea, that has been sanctioned almost greater than any other nation on the face of this planet by the United States, and yet they're allowed to be in the United Nations. They're allowed to be a full part of the diplomatic community. And so I think this is just a good contrast, where why is the nation that's testing nuclear bombs in violation of every sanction possible being treated better than Taiwan, that is a great international partner? So I'm going to withdraw these 2 amendments for the sake of moving forward on 1928, but I do think it's important that we continue this conversation. I thank you for the work you've been doing on this legislation.
Well, thank you, and I do want to point out that as a new member on this committee, you passed one of the most meaningful pieces of legislation ever has been passed on North Korea. I know we've had legislation that has passed since that time, and I know there's a banking committee piece that has passed out on sanctions. I understand you're working very closely with us and with the sponsors of that bill to add your language there, and I just want to thank you for being so focused on that part of the world and your leadership of that committee. And thank you for withdrawing these so that we can work constructively towards another end on the bill I'm talking about. Is there a motion to approve the legislation as amended? So moved. Is there a second? So moved and second. The questions on the motion to approve S 1928 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? With that, the ayes have it. The legislation as amended is agreed to. That completes the committee's business. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, the committee stands adjourned exactly at 10:15, as we said. We will see Finance Committee members later. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
If I could just briefly thank you for working with me on this bill. Thank Senator Cardin, and thank everybody who's been a co-sponsor. We spend $10 billion a year on the United Nations, World Bank, and a lot of other organizations, and I appreciate this approach, and I appreciate Senator Merkley's amendment that'll make the whole methodology more transparent. I think we have to continue on a bipartisan way to work to make sure that what foreign aid we are investing is done well and wisely, and I appreciate the opportunity to work together on the bill.
Well, I appreciate being able to work with you on this, and I think people understand, too, this also gives us the ability with this data to strongly support those agencies that we believe ought to be strongly supported if they're producing good results. So,
Correct.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
So with that, we will now move to the hearing. The hearing itself will actually come to order. We thank General Kaler, Dr. Fever, Mr. McKeon for joining us today and for sitting through the business meeting over the last 15 minutes. A number of members on both sides of the aisle of this on and off the committee have raised questions about the executive's authorities with respect to war making and the use of nuclear weapons, and from a diplomatic perspective, entering into and terminating agreements with other countries. As I've mentioned publicly, this is one in a series of hearings where our committee will examine all of these issues, but today it's my hope that we will remain focused on the topic at hand, the authority and the process for the use of nuclear weapons. The Congressional Research Service tells us this is the first time that the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate or House has met on this topic since 1976, 41 years ago. Making the decision to go to war of any sort is a heavy responsibility for our nation's elected leaders, and the decision to use nuclear weapons is the most consequential of all. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 and the subsequent practices recognize that the use of nuclear weapons must be subject to political control. This is why no general or admiral or defense secretary has the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. Only the president, the elected political leader of the United States, has this authority. The nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War dramatically elevated the risk of nuclear conflict. As the Soviets developed massive numbers of nuclear weapons and the systems to develop them to the United States, to deliver them to the United States, we planned for the unthinkable, how to get our missiles in the air within those few minutes before their warheads could hit us and possibly destroy our ability to respond. In that kind of scenario, there's no time for debate. Having such forces at the ready has been successful in deterring such an attack, and for that we are grateful. But this process means the President has the sole authority to give that order, whether we are responding to a nuclear attack or not. Once that order is given and verified, there is no way to revoke it. To be clear, I would not support changes that would reduce our deterrence of adversaries or reassurance of our allies. But I would like to explore, as our predecessors in the House did 41 years ago, the realities of this system. I want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses and the members of this committee for the seriousness with which they approached this topic before us today, and hope that together we can have a productive and enlightening discussion about this sober issue. And with that, I'd like to turn to my friend and our distinguished ranking member, Senator Cardin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I almost always, in a perfunctory way, thank you for holding hearings, but in this case, I really do believe this is a critically important discussion to have, not just with ourselves in the United States Senate, but with the American people. I must tell you, I am always amazed as to what subjects come up at town hall meetings that I hold throughout Maryland. Most of the subjects deal with the local economic or domestic issues. We don't normally get a lot of foreign policy questions at town hall meetings, but of late, I've been getting more and more questions about, can the president really order a nuclear attack without any controls? That question is asked more and more by the American people. And of course, it's fueled by comments made by President Trump in regards to North Korea. Quoting the president in his August interview, North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Or the president's comments will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Now, many interpret that to mean that the president is actively considering the use of nuclear weapons in order to deal with the threat of North Korea. That is frightening. And as the chairman pointed out, based on my understanding of the nuclear command and control protocols, there are no checks on the President's authority. The system, as it is set up today, provides the President with the sole and ultimate authority to use nuclear weapons. And that was developed because of the realities of the security of our country. The nuclear command and control system we have in place is the result of three factors. The first was that the particular threat and challenge of the Cold War. For decades, the United States faced a nuclear-armed adversary in the Soviet Union with a large and capable nuclear force. The United States settled upon a strategy of mutual assured destruction, which placed distinctive commands on our nuclear warfighting command and control system. The second, and a related factor, is the law of physics. An ICBM launch from Russia to the United States would have about a 30-minute flight time. There wasn't time to convene a special session of Congress or to have the type of consultations that would infringe upon our ability to have actually a deterrent. This means the President and his team have an incredibly short window to identify, assess, communicate, decide, and if necessary, launch a nuclear force. There was no time for cabinet meetings and no time for consultation. The Cold War may be long behind us, but such a scenario, based upon the need to deter a massive Soviet nuclear attack with little or no warning time, remains the driving force behind the current command and control architecture even today. The final factor behind U.S. nuclear command and control system rests with the fact that nuclear weapons, ever since their development, have always been considered unique, not like any other military weapon. Starting under President Truman, the point was made crystal clear that the White House was in charge of the atomic bomb and its uses, not the military. Nuclear bombs were not a military weapon whose use would be controlled by the armed forces, but a strategic weapon under the strict control of civilian and elected officials. The President, as both our highest elected civilian official and Commander-in-Chief under the Constitution, played a unique role with this unique weapon. The President, and only the President, assumed the sole and unchecked power to launch nuclear attacks. As President Truman said, you have got to understand that this isn't a military weapon. It is used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses. So we have got to treat this thing differently from rifles and cannons and ordinary things like that. Nuclear weapons remain unique, but today we face a different question than the one we faced during the Cold War. Given today's challenges, we need to revisit this question on whether a single individual should have the sole and unchecked authority to launch a nuclear attack under all circumstances, including the right to use it as a first strike. The most likely attack we face is not a massive surprise nuclear attack by Russia or China, but a nuclear conflict that springs from an escalating conflict with the smaller nuclear forces such as North Korea. In this sort of circumstance, where the United States would not face the same sort of use them or lose them pressure we faced during the Cold War, it may be possible and certainly wise for the President to take the time to consult Congress before the profound and historic decision to use nuclear weapons is made. I would like to be able to tell my constituents and the American people we have a system in place that prevents an impulsive and irrational decision to use nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, I cannot make that assurance today. I look forward to hearing from our three very distinguished witnesses. I just would like to acknowledge Mr. McKinnon's presence here as a former counsel to this committee under Senator Biden. It's nice to have him back before our committee.
Thank you so much. Our first witness today is General Bob Kaler, Commander of the United States Strategic Command from 2011 to 2013. Thank you for being back with us today, and thank you for your service to our country. Our second witness is Dr. Peter Feaver, Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Thank you so much for being here today. Our third witness is Dr. Ryan McKeon, the Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, and once a staff member, as was mentioned on this committee. Thank you for coming back. If all of you are very familiar, if you could summarize your comments in about 5 minutes, we would appreciate that. Any written materials you have without objection will be entered into the record, and if you could just begin and proceed in the order introduced, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Senator Cardin, distinguished members of the committee. It's my honor to appear today to discuss nuclear decision-making. I'm also really pleased to appear with these two outstanding panelists and colleagues to my right. Command and control is a critically important component of our nuclear deterrent, and I applaud you for taking the time to understand it better. At the outset, I must say that the views I expressed this morning are mine. I no longer represent the Department or Strategic Command or the U.S. Air Force. I will try to bring the perspective of almost 4 decades of military service and senior military command to my remarks today, and much of that was in nuclear-related duty. Let me also add that some of the nation's most closely guarded secrets are associated with nuclear weapons, with the plans associated with them, and with the processes as well. So there are limits on what I can say, even if some aspects of this matter are discussed openly by others. In the interest of time, I'd like to make just 3 brief opening remarks. First, as this committee knows well, the U.S. now faces more complex security problems and greater uncertainty than it did during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons are not gone from world affairs, and it doesn't look to me like they're going to be gone from world affairs anytime soon. Russia and China are modernizing their forces as the basis of strategies designed to expand their positions at our expense and the expense of our allies. Russia frequently makes explicit nuclear threats, to include the threat of nuclear first use. China will soon deploy ballistic missile submarines, opening a new chapter in their nuclear history. North Korea threatens our regional allies and forward-based forces and is pursuing the capability to threaten the U.S. directly. North Korea has also threatened nuclear first use. Iran, of course, remains a country of interest. Other strategic threats like long-range conventional weapons, cyber weapons, and threats against critical space assets have emerged and can arrive at our doorstep quickly, but nuclear weapons remain important in the strategies of our potential adversaries. The second point, while the U.S. nuclear force is far smaller, postured less aggressively, and occupies a less prominent place in our defense strategy than it did during the Cold War, nuclear deterrence remains crucial to our defense and to strategic stability. There's an old saying that I've used many times over the years that deterrence exists when an adversary believes they can't achieve their objectives, will suffer unacceptable consequences if they try, or both. U.S. nuclear weapons prevent the coercive or actual use of these weapons against us and our allies, which is their primary purpose, constrain the scope and scale of conflict, compel adversaries to ponder the consequences of their actions before they act, and obviate the need for additional allies to acquire their own. No other weapon can replace the deterrent value of nuclear weapons and the ability to command and control our nuclear forces under all conditions of crisis and conflict remains central to the credibility of the deterrent. Third, U.S. nuclear forces operate under strict civilian control. Only the President of the United States can order the employment of U.S. nuclear weapons, and the President's ability to exercise that authority and direction is ensured by people, processes, and capabilities that comprise the nuclear command and control system. This is a system controlled by human beings. Nothing happens automatically. That system is designed to do 2 very important things. First, it's designed to enable the authorized use of nuclear weapons while preventing the unauthorized use or the accidental use or the inadvertent use of them. And 2, to do so in the face of a wide variety of scenarios, including a nuclear attack. And the challenge of the Cold War, which is a short-notice massive attack, while less likely today, I would agree, still exists. A colleague and mentor of mine has always said that when you're looking at an adversary, you have to look at capability and intent. The Russians may not have the intent of attacking us today with a short-notice massive attack, but they retain the capability to do so, and so long as they do, we have to deter that capability. The nuclear decision process includes assessment, review, and consultation between the President and key civilian and military leaders, followed by transmission and implementation of any presidential decision by the forces themselves. All activities surrounding nuclear weapons are characterized by layers of safeguards, tests, and reviews. Finally, I think it's important to remember that the United States military doesn't blindly follow orders. A presidential order to employ U.S. nuclear weapons must be legal. The basic legal principles of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality apply to nuclear weapons just as they do to every other weapon. It was my job and the job of other senior leaders like the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman and the other combatant commanders to make sure these principles were applied to nuclear orders. As I close, I want to urge caution as you consider these matters. Changes or conflicting signals can have profound implications for deterrence, for extended deterrence, and for the confidence of the men and the women in the nuclear forces. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fever.
So, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic, which I will refer to as nuclear command and control. My bottom line is simple. In the past, Congress has played a vital role in pushing the executive branch to strengthen command and control, and the time may be ripe for another close look. However, we must proceed with some caution because the topic is complex and susceptible to unintended consequences. I'll make 4 points. First, at the heart of nuclear command and control is what might be called the always-never dilemma. For nuclear deterrence to work, we must have a high assurance that the country will always be able to present a credible nuclear strike capability to our adversaries, even in the most dire scenarios. However, because even a single nuclear detonation would be so consequential and might trigger an escalatory spiral that would lead to civilization-threatening outcomes, we must also have a high assurance that there will never be an accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. The challenge is that measures designed to improve the always side of the equation can compromise the negative side and vice versa. Pre-delegating the authority to use nuclear weapons and spreading that capability to do so to lower echelons may thwart an enemy's first strike planning, for example, but it would increase the risk that a weapon might be used in an unauthorized fashion or by someone confused in the fog of battle. The history of nuclear command and control is a history of civilian and military leaders debating the proper balance between always and never. It is a history of occasional discoveries that the risks on one side or the other side of the ledger were greater than originally understood. And it is a history of improvements, some like permissive action links, PALs, which are coded locks that blocked detonation of a weapon without inserting the PIN code and were pressed by far-seeing congressional advocates, these improvements that may have helped forestall disaster. This brings me to my second major point. We must be willing to invest the requisite funds to keep our technology up to date. But in the nuclear command and control business, hardware is trumped by software, and software is trumped by wetware. Hardware refers to the technologies like the PALs I just mentioned. Software refers to the rules and procedures that govern how the hardware is used. For instance, the code management system that determines who has the PAL codes and who's authorized to release them. Wetware refers to the human element, the reliability of people involved in enforcing the rules, and the civil-military relations that form the political context in which the software and hardware operate. At the end of the day, what would matter most is the human element. Would the President's advisors be in a position to provide timely counsel, and would that counsel shape the President's decisions? Would the various echelons in the chain of command recognize a valid authenticated nuclear use order as being legal, given the military's deeply ingrained training to refuse to implement any illegal order? Indeed, would subordinate elements of the command and control system do what they're supposed to do, no more and no less, but with appropriate judgment? This last point cannot be overemphasized. For decades now, it's been technically possible to build a nuclear command and control system that would eliminate the human element altogether. Every generation of strategic leaders has understood that such a system would be foolhardy in the extreme. The human element introduces risks, to be sure, but it also introduces the opportunity to mitigate risks. This brings me to my third major point. The best reforms to nuclear command and control would be ones that maximized the opportunity for the human element to mitigate risks by maximizing time for deliberation and assessment. Of course, efforts to extend decision times must not run afoul of the always-never dilemma. I conclude with my fourth and final point. The time is ripe for a fresh look. Changes in communications technology and rapidly evolving cyber threats alone would justify a fresh examination. Threats that were warned about 5 years ago have become urgent realities today. And finally, our divisive political environment has raised new doubts about the effectiveness of all our branches of government to wield the power they possess responsibly. In that context, a thoroughgoing review of nuclear command and control could help shore up nuclear confidence in this area. Outside experts have suggested many possible improvements that are worth considering. For instance, there are a variety of proposals that involve requiring certifications by additional cabinet officials of launch orders under certain circumstances. However, all of these proposals raise important constitutional questions about usurping the president's authorities. Because the actual operations of the current system are exceedingly complex, I would recommend great caution before legislating any particular fix. Nevertheless, I would recommend diligence and perseverance in oversight of the system to reassure our friends and to warn our enemies that the nuclear arsenal will function as it is intended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. McKeon.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cardin, members of the committee, thank you for your invitation to be here today. It's nice to be back in this room after spending so many years of my professional life working on the staff of this committee. And I'll digress briefly, Mr. Chairman, to say I'm very impressed by how quickly you mustered a quorum, having spent numerous hours waiting and waiting and waiting for that magic 10th senator to show up.
Thank you. It's one of the rare times that occurred, but
Your
I'm glad you
efficiency
were
is
able to
impressive.
witness that, so thank you.
I'll briefly address 3 questions and try not to duplicate my colleagues. First, who has the authority to employ nuclear weapons? In one respect, the answer is simple. The President does. As Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces under the Constitution, he is the sole authority within the executive branch for such a decision. Some authority in military operations is delegated to the Secretary of Defense and then further delegated to appropriate combatant commanders. The authority to use nuclear weapons, however, remains with the President. That is as it should be in a republic, given the gravity of the decision and the consequences of any nuclear use. It bears emphasis that the President would not make this decision by himself. The system for decision is designed to ensure that the President consults with the National Security Council and his other senior civilian and military advisors, and I would expect that to occur in every case where the use of nuclear weapons is contemplated. That is hardly the end of the inquiry. The authority to employ nuclear weapons is closely intertwined with an equally momentous question: who has the authority to take the country to war? Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and several other powers with regard to supporting and regulating the armed forces. To the President, Article 2 provides he is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. The constitutional text, structure, and our history provide Congress with primacy in this sphere. This power is not merely limited to formal declarations of war, which Congress has not done since World War II, but to authorizing most uses of military force. To be sure, the President possesses the constitutional authority to defend against sudden attack or to preempt an imminent attack. But Article 2 does not give him carte blanche to take the country to war. In the modern era, presidents of both parties have often made broad assertions of authority to take military action without prior authorization by Congress in a manner that the framers would not have recognized. Nonetheless, we need not resolve this general debate to answer the specific question presented in today's world. In addition to the global terrorism challenge, our major potential adversaries today number on one hand Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. 3 of these countries possess nuclear weapons, and the 4th has pursued such a capability. Therefore, conflict with any of these states could conceivably involve nuclear weapons use. Direct armed conflict with these countries would undoubtedly be war in the constitutional sense if initiated by the Congress, and if initiated by the United States, would require authorization by the Congress. A recent executive branch opinion on the war power by the Office of Legal Counsel in 2011 supports this conclusion. It indicated that analysis of whether congressional authorization of a use of military force is required would turn on the examination of, quote, the nature, scope, and duration, end quote, of the conflict, and that specific congressional approval would be necessary in cases of, quote, prolonged and substantial military engagements typically involving exposure of U.S. military personnel to significant risk over a substantial period of time, end of quote. It is hard to imagine an armed conflict scenario with any of these countries that would not meet that test. The rapid advances of North Korea's nuclear and missile program and the escalating rhetoric between the president and the North Korean leader are no doubt foremost in your minds. In the North Korean context, the view that Congress would need to authorize a war is buttressed by the recent letter to your House colleagues by the Vice Director of the Joint Staff, Rear Admiral Michael Dumont, where he stated that a ground invasion would be required in order to locate and destroy all components of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Given the high number of casualties that would occur in any conflict with North Korea, let alone during a ground invasion, no reasonable argument can be made that that would not be war in the constitutional sense. The President and his senior administration officials have stated that time is running out to address the North Korean challenge, and in August, the National Security Advisor suggested the possibility of a preventive war. Such a war, as distinct from a preemptive strike in the face of impending attack, would also require congressional authorization. For context on these two questions, I would answer a third. What is the current policy on use of nuclear weapons? In my prepared statement, I highlight several elements of the results of the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010 and the Presidential Employment Guidance issued in 2013, which remain in place while the Trump administration completes the Nuclear Posture Review ordered by the President in January. General Kaler has described some of these elements as well in his statement. Most important, the 2010 NPR set forth the goal of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy, and it's important to understand there's nothing in the current guidance that compels the use of nuclear weapons in a high-end conflict. Finally, I would note the Obama administration did not adopt a formal policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, although in the final month of the administration, Vice President Biden gave a speech in which he said that given our non-nuclear capabilities and the nature of today's threats, it is hard to envision a plausible scenario in which the first use of nuclear weapons would be necessary. He went on to say that he and the President were confident that we can deter and defend ourselves against and our allies against non-nuclear threats through other means. Closing, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank all three of you for that outstanding testimony. As usual, I'm going to reserve my time for interjections and turn to our ranking member.
Let me also thank all three of you, not just for your appearance here today, but for your service to our country on these very difficult issues. I'm going to preface my question with my strong belief that there is not a military solution to the crisis in North Korea, that any military option carries unbelievable risk factors, whether it be conventional or the use of nuclear weapons. And I hope that the President's trip to Asia has produced the openings towards a diplomatic surge that will recognize that both China and the United States should be looking for off-ramps to this crisis, and they have a lot in common, and China can change the equation in North Korea. So I hope that's where we are heading, because the use of any military option has extreme risks. So this is not a hypothetical discussion. What concerns me is that the President may be getting military options, and the use of conventional weapons could lead to extreme number of casualties in Japan or in South Korea. So there may be a discussion about whether a nuclear first strike could prevent that from occurring or have a less of a chance of that occurring. So it is not a hypothetical discussion. So, General, I was particularly impressed by your statement, which says, in addition, the legal principles of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality also apply to nuclear plans, operations, and decisions. So how is the President legally restrained, if at all, on the use of a nuclear first strike as a result of the orders that are there under command that it must be proportional, or that there's a distinction that requires this military necessity? Is there any real restraint on the President on choosing a nuclear first strike in a circumstance in North Korea?
Senator, I think there are. I think that there are always legal constraints when any military option is being considered. There's been a long-standing debate about nuclear weapons and morality and legality and where nuclear weapons fit in all of that, given that things changed in August of 1945. And there has been, I think, a long-standing policy view from the United States that nuclear weapons are not inherently illegal. They can be used illegally. The question is, under what circumstances and what situation? And what I can tell you is that when I was involved as the commander of STRATCOM in planning, pre-planning options that we are ordered to do, the president directs, every president has directed the military to pre-plan some options, more as time has passed for additional flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. We involved our legal advisors in every step of that process.
So let me interrupt you there. So there is discussion taking place at the National Security Council level with legal advisors, with military advisors. And the advice is that under the guidelines on proportionality and necessity, that this is not appropriate for use of a nuclear first strike. Is there action that can be taken by those advisors if the president overrules that decision and says, no, we're going with a nuclear attack?
Other than to state their view about the legality of the move, the president retains constitutional authority to order some military action. The military, you would be in a very interesting constitutional situation, I believe. Because again, the military is obligated to follow legal orders, but is not obligated to follow illegal orders. The question
Who
about
would make that
legality-
judgment on behalf of the operational command under the DOD?
Well, I think it's one of the things that would be on the plate of the commander of Strategic Command. I always believed that was on my plate. That ultimately, it's very difficult.
So let me just drill down on this. If you believe that this did not meet the legal test of proportionality, even if ordered by the President of the United States to use a nuclear first strike, you believe that because of legalities, you retain that decision to disobey the Commander-in-Chief?
Yes. If there is an illegal order presented to the military is obligated to refuse to follow it. Now, the question is just the one that you described, is the process leading to that determination and how you arrive at that. And I would concede to you that that would be a very difficult process and a very difficult conversation. But in the scenario that you're painting here, I would also argue that there's time for that. There's time for that kind of a deliberate conversation on these matters.
And just to complete this cycle, part of this is the protocols that have been established under executive orders on the use of nuclear that require the proportionality that you're talking about. Others is the inherent responsibility of military command to follow only orders that are lawful. Am I reading that correct?
Right. Yes.
So there's two different sets, because you may very well be getting opinions from the commander from the White House that this is legal, but you would have to make your own independent judgment based upon history and based upon following only legal orders.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to use my first interjection here. So in the event someone in your former position received an order that you knew had not been vetted through the National Security Council, for instance, that discussions had not taken place, that just you got a call out of the blue, things were tense in a particular area, and you received that order, would you consider that to be legal or not legal?
I never felt, Senator, that I had to vet orders through the National Security Council. I felt, as a military senior leader, that I had three obligations. One obligation was to provide my military advice. One obligation was to raise any concerns that I had, if they happen to be legal concerns, to raise those concerns. And then the third obligation that I had was related to the legality of the order, either follow a legal order or refuse to follow a legal order. I had legal advisors myself. I fully expected that we would involve the Secretary's legal advisors, the Chairman's legal advisors. Where DOD took that from there, it was sort of their issue to take. But this, I would certainly have been in consultation with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
General, I want to continue down along this line of questioning. From my standpoint, there's really two basic scenarios. The scenario when we are under imminent attack, or there's an attack that is imminent, and then one where it is more preemptive, where there is time. You said there's always going to be time. There may not always be time,
No,
correct?
I didn't mean to suggest that it would always be time. I agree with that.
So when the President would determine that we are under the threat of almost an imminent attack, he has almost absolute authority, correct?
Yes, context matters here, and yes.
So is there any process to assess imminent at that moment?
So I'm a former commander, not a lawyer. So there's
I'm an accountant, so.
But let me just say this, to try to shed some light on this. Context matters here. If, in fact, in a range of scenarios where nuclear weapon use is possible, or there's a potential for nuclear weapons use, U.S. policy has helped us clarify over the years under what circumstances we might expect to use nuclear weapons. So, for example, the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review said, extreme circumstances when vital national interests are at stake. As a commander, I had that in my mind as a context for nuclear weapons. And if we had tactical warning that an attack was underway, then we were into a playbook, basically, that had been vetted for its legal viability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So we've somewhat defined imminent? I mean, obviously, if you see radar saying that
Absolutely.
missiles have launched, that's obviously imminent.
Right.
What if it's right before?
Well, there's also the conditions where you might have strategic warning, where we have solid warning that something will happen.
That's already game planned out in terms of what strategic warning is that would,
Well,
Say it was imminent?
it's not precisely defined, but I think it would be certainly one of those matters under consideration. Tactical warning, by the way, carries with it some amount of time urgency, either for the survival of the decision maker or for a decision about what to do in terms of responding. Strategic warning is not as time urgent. And so more time gets introduced into these scenarios as you go from the most extreme stressing scenario back to the left.
so that's the next scenario is where it's more strategic and you have time. And let's say you get a presidential order to launch,
Right.
but you're in the position and you know that it has not gone, you have not followed the process. It has not been properly vetted. In that case, in your position, you believe that is an illegal order?
No, I believe you have to determine whether that's illegal.
But you would have that, you believe that is your responsibility, and you would have the authority to
Yes.
say, this is not legal because we have not followed the steps, we haven't gone through the process.
I would have said, I have a question about this, and I would have said, I'm not ready to proceed.
And then what happens?
Well, as I say, I don't know exactly. No. Fortunately, these are all hypothetical scenarios. I mean, they're real in terms of our.
We're holding a hearing on this, so.
They're all, exactly. This is the human factor in our system. The human factor then kicks in. It's what Dr. Fever said. There's a human element to this. And at that point, I think, as with any military order, it doesn't matter really. The consequences are higher if it's an order on nuclear weapons, but it's the same principle on any order.
So the point is, there's a lot of human intervention between a presidential order when there's time, it's not imminent, to really ask the questions, to lay out the fact we haven't gone through this process, this is not well thought out, it's not proportional, so we can have a little comfort that even though the president has the authority, there are limits to that even within this context when there is time.
I believe that's true, and even if time is compressed, there are circumstances that I could envision where I would have said the same thing, which is, wait, stop. We need to resolve these issues, or we need to address this question, or whatever. And the process provides for that in that it's ultimately an interaction among human beings. The decision authority resides with the president, however.
Thank you for those answers. Thanks for your service.
Yes, sir.
Let me just, before we move to the next, the person who's in your position is a Senate confirmed, it's a Senate confirmed position, is that
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
And typically the person that's put in your position is recommended by the military or by the civil, how does it typically work?
Well, I can tell you how it worked for me. The Secretary of Defense, in my case, the Secretary of Defense interviewed a number of candidates, decided on a candidate to recommend to the president. There was a process that was gone through there at some level, and I became the president's nominee to the Senate, and then you all operated.
Most of the people who've ended up being in these positions, are they people that have moved up through the defense mechanisms solely? This is not a political position. Typically, it's a position that's based on merit.
It is not a political position, and it's a position that is based on, I believe, experience, and I would like to think merit as well, but certainly experience, certainly there are a lot of factors that go into selection for senior command. That's a great question, I think, for you to pose to other witnesses who have been in the position to select senior commanders. I was the beneficiary of that selection.
Mr. Chairman, I can tell you, at least from my vantage point in the Pentagon, but also as Chief of Staff to the National Security Council, the process General Kaler describes is the process the Secretary and the Chairman huddle and look at various candidates from the services for the four-star combatant commands. And under President Obama, he personally interviewed most of the candidates who were recommended for selection.
And typically, Mr. Chairman, in recent years, the commanders of some of the combatant commanders have been typically 4 stars on their second or third assignment. So I was not a first-time 4-star when I was nominated to take command of Strategic Command. That was my second 4-star assignment.
Thank you, Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here today. The first use of U.S. nuclear weapons would appear to be a clear declaration of war. Certainly the recipient of a U.S. nuclear attack would perceive it that way. Under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can declare war. Should Congress require the President to seek authorization for the first use of nuclear weapons? Why or why not? Mr. McKeon, why don't we start with you?
Well, Senator, as I laid out in my opening statement, it's my view, certainly if the United States were to initiate a war with another nuclear state and we conceive that the use of nuclear weapons might be possible, that's war in the constitutional sense that Congress should authorize. If we are under attack from a nuclear state using nuclear weapons, that's a different question, and the President would have the authority under Article 2 to respond, whether with a conventional or nuclear weapons. The hardest question is the in-between question, and what Senator Johnson was getting at is where do you define imminence on the continuum?
How do you define it?
Well, it would be very fact-specific, to give you a bit of a lawyer's dodge, but that kind of the most obvious case is we see a missile on a launch pad or several missiles on several launch pads, and we have good intelligence that they intend to not test them but launch them at the United States. That seems like a pretty clear case of imminence. And then you would move down a continuum away from that to where it becomes less imminent and looks more like a preventive attack.
Mr. Fever and General?
what I would say is distinguish between scenarios where the military wake up the president versus scenarios where the president's waking up the military. Where the military wakes up the president and warns him that there is about to be an attack or that we're experiencing an attack, in those settings, the president has a very limited time window to make a decision. He would make a decision. He alone would have the authority to make the decision, and I think we all believe that the system would carry out the order that he gave. The